Hey everyone, welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. I'm Cole Altum. Joining me today is Jacob Shapiro and Phil Orchard. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day of watching World Cup soccer to talk for a second.
I didn't realize that I was watching World Cup soccer. That's what's on television that everyone's talking about?
You've probably never heard of it. It's just the most popular sport in the world, and every 4 years, a bunch of countries field teams and they play against each other.
And this year, they happen to be all on during the workday. So thanks, boss.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Our trenchant insight into global athleticism aside, I brought you guys here today because I want to talk about North Korea. Now, obviously, Donald Trump met with Kim Jong Un in Singapore on June 12th, and that's basically what everybody in the world, including ourselves, have been talking about for the past couple days. But I want to make sure that we're talking about the right things and we're talking about them for the right reasons. It has been very showy, and a lot of negotiations such as this are necessarily showy, right? This is the stage of negotiations where you act in good faith and you make some gestures of goodwill, things like that. So as it stands right now, the United States, for the first time in a while, is seriously considering halting military exercises with South Korea. And that's no small thing for North Korea, because these exercises simulate decapitation operations and amphibious landings and all these different things that really make North Korea worry. My question to you guys is, are we talking about the right things? Do these gestures of good faith actually matter, or to what extent do they matter? And supposing it all kind of goes well, what does that mean for the region? I know it's really open-ended, but it's kind of meant to be.
Well, I guess what I would start off by saying is that I have actually been very frustrated with the entire North Korean situation. And I keep thinking back to that Karl Marx quote, first history repeats itself as tragedy and then as farce. And I don't know whether this is a farce. I don't know whether this is some third category where first it was tragedy and then it was farce, and Kim Jong Un is supposed to be, I don't know, what's the next thing? World peace in that equation? I have no idea. It's very, very hard for me to take a lot of the diplomatic pageantry seriously. That said, and that aside, the real thing we're talking about here is the United States and North Korea finding a pragmatic way to deal with each other in a way that the United States and North Korea have never dealt with each other before, in a way that the United States has historically not dealt very well with some of its enemies, for lack of a better word. We can think about Iran in this sense, even in the context of the nuclear deal, which lasted for a couple of years. It was very hard for the United States to establish any kind of relationship with Iran because there was just so much political inertia in the way that prevented them from doing that. If this is the United States and North Korea dealing with each other on that pragmatic basis, it, for me, can either be one of two things. Number one, China is the sort of the master puppeteer behind all of this, pulling all the strings, and everything is happening the way that China wants it to. Or Kim Jong Un and in general North Korea has become so uncomfortable with the level of dependence on China and with China's increasing strength and its desire to assert itself more in its regional neighborhood, that it has decided that it needs some kind of grand bargain with the United States more than it needs to be sealed off from the rest of the world. Philip, how do you react to that? How have you been looking at this?
Well, I wouldn't underplay what North Korea has been able to achieve here. They have the same number of nukes that they did before the summit. They could still make more. There was no substance in the joint communique suggesting that they are actually agreeing to eliminate them. They're getting what they want here. And especially if this leads to some kind of sanctions relief, a reduction of the U.S. force posture on the peninsula, they can live with the status quo. And they're sort of gently leading the U.S. to sort of a future where we just kind of learn to live with them and tolerate their status as a sort of Pakistan-like nuclear power that probably can't strike the U.S. mainland with any degree of certainty, but is in all intents and purposes a nuclear power, and pretty secure one in that, allowing them to pivot toward an era where they focus more on economic development and sort of dictate regional events a little bit more on their terms, and that includes China.
The question I would raise there is that we talk a lot about what North Korea wants and prioritize their list. What does North Korea want more than anything else right now, and what do they want long term?
Well, this is the big question, right? Because if what you think North Korea wants is strictly regime survival, you have to deal with them in a much different way than if what North Korea really wants is reunification of the Korean Peninsula. I think one of the things that Kim Jong Un has proven so far is that he is a strategic thinker. He is a realistic thinker. This is not somebody who is crazy or who is dreaming crazy things up. And the idea that North Korea could reunify the Korean Peninsula and have the entire system under its political structure that doesn't make sense. On paper, there's no way that you're going to get South Korea, which is a modern industrialized economy with all the things that come with that, to sign up for a political structure that is led from the north by Pyongyang, where people live in the capital decently well off, I guess, and then other people are basically in the gulag, working on their farms. If what North Korea really wants is reunification, and if it thinks that the joining of North Korea and South Korea together is what is necessary, not just for North Korea, but for Korea's future, in a system where China is more powerful, where Japan is more powerful, where the United States is still here, where we shouldn't forget that Russia's fooling around in these waters as well, then perhaps you have to think of Kim Jong Un as someone who is saying, look, like, I'm a statesman and I have to make sure that my people survive, and I'm willing to do X, Y, and Z in order to get to that promised land. Just to be clear, that's me thinking very imaginatively and giving a whole lot of credit to Kim Jong Un that maybe he does or doesn't deserve. All I'm saying there is that if reunification is what North Korea wants, I think we have to start thinking in terms of reunification on Pyongyang's terms by itself. That's a crazy thing. If North Korea is thinking about reunification as the most important thing, I think we have to deal with them in a much different way than we would. They just want regime safety. If you stop the military exercises and stop threatening them, maybe they'll just leave everyone alone.
I don't think it's crazy to think that that's what both sides want. That's been the stated goal of the North and the South for a long time. Obviously, it's kind of politically convenient. There's not a lot of substance to any kind of actual plan to bring that about. But that is, as we've written about and discussed at length in the past, that the Korean Peninsula unification is an imperative for both sides, and it would put them in a much stronger position. I think both sides are pretty realistic about what it would take. It would presumably be a decades-long process, starting with a very, very loose, almost symbolic confederation, allowing both sides to sort of very gradually take teeny tiny steps toward an arrangement that would actually have some substance and allow the peninsula to project power and execute a foreign policy strategy coherently in a combined manner. Obviously the mechanics are what are complicated and possibly prohibitive, but I think what we're seeing now is part of that long-term process. That it can't start with the two Koreas at each other's throats all the time. They have to go down this road of these small good faith measures and formally striking a peace treaty at some point and so forth. It's a lot easier for the North to feel comfortable about doing that with nuclear weapons, the sort of sense of security that it gives them. But even that, even with them, it doesn't change the fact that there are a lot of other parties, with a stake in how this turns out.
I don't think anybody discounts like all the practical obstacles and all the difficulties that lay ahead, kind of no matter what happens. Even just maintaining the status quo is not going to be a super easy thing. But Jacob mentioned creativity and thinking outside the box, and I'm not being funny here, but maybe that's exactly what everybody needs to be doing. I mean, these are strange and unprecedented times we're living in. This would have been unthinkable a year ago. Not just the summit itself, but Dennis Rodman was there, and funded and advertising a marijuana cryptocurrency. And then there was that trailer that the White House made as sort of an outreach to Kim Jong Un. I don't know if y'all saw that, but it was amazing. And maybe thinking outside the box is exactly what everybody needs to be doing. Maybe that's what they're doing, and maybe that's what we need to be doing. So in the spirit of that thinking, let's think of some weird scenarios. What if tomorrow they came out and said, you know what? Korean War is over. We've resolved it. Everybody signed pieces of paper and it's done. Does that mean anything? Does that facilitate peace? Excuse me, not peace, but total and complete denuclearization? Do these things actually matter? I guess just throw out some other unlikely scenarios that might play out.
Well, Cole, first of all, I just want to say that thank you for giving some evidence for my statement about how this has all become a farce, because between Dennis Rodman and the cryptocurrency and everything else you said, I feel less bad about calling it a farce just a couple minutes ago.
That is nothing if not farcical. I mean, it's just bizarre. And it's not a criticism, it's just strange.
But to answer your question, I guess, I could think of any number of scenarios, but the one thing that has been bothering me, and I wonder what you think about this, Philip, is the two countries for whom Korean unification is bad, to my mind, are China and Japan. Those are the two losers. If if Korea unifies, whether it's led by the North or by the South, maybe if it's led by the North, China gets a short-term bump. If it's led by the South, maybe Japan gets a short-term bump. But if you're thinking long-term for both of those countries, a unified Korean peninsula is bad for both of them. For the United States, a unified Korean peninsula, as long as it isn't going to say crazy things to the United States and threaten to blow the United States off the map, is actually a good thing. The most imaginative thing we can say is that South Korea and North Korea are like East and West Germany, and we're heading towards an inevitable process of reunification. Getting rid of the state of war between South and North Korea, coal is a part of that. By itself, it's nothing. But if it is a part of this process where the two come closer together, it just seems to me that the major players involved here have no interest in that. And that starts to make me nervous that I've missed something here, because China, for all that I can tell, is cool with everything that's going on, has been supporting Kim, has been meeting with Kim, has been escorting him to these meetings in Singapore. I don't understand why they would want to go that route, and that makes me question whether that's even in play.
I would say with China, the first thing they want right now is to forestall a war. And so in that respect, they see this diplomatic process as doing exactly that. And so they're, happy to see North Korea do and say whatever they can to keep this going. And considering that reunification is such a long-term process and such an improbable one, I don't think they feel like they're working against their interest here at this point. When it comes to Japan, I just don't think they have a lot they can do about it at this point. They don't, they can't start a war on their own. They have some economic leverage, but not much. They don't get along with South Korea any more than the Chinese or the North Koreans do in most ways. So they're kind of stuck to the sideline and playing defense, which is why you see them building up shedding their internal constraints on building up a military that can more proactively, secure their interests.
I think another thing that bothers me, and you brought to mind some of this for me, is that the situation with the division of the Korean Peninsula, it's inherently irrational. All of the things that we're talking about here, they really don't make sense on a geopolitical basis. The United States' involvement on the Korean Peninsula, if you're just looking at it in straight strategic terms, didn't really make sense at the time, right? There were all these other political concerns about the Soviet Union and the Cold War and domestic politics in the United States that brought the United States into that war. But if you're the United States and you're just trying to deal in a completely unemotional way, you would say, look, the United States has to be allies with Japan, with the Philippines, with Taiwan. We have to be able to contain the communists in both China and Russia. And the Korean Peninsula doesn't really do much for you. So the United States is involved in South Korea without real geopolitical logic. It was really more of a political issue. It pushes all the way up to the Yalu River because it basically doesn't have a good sense of what China's thinking. China then pushes back against the U.S. troops and pushes them back to the 30th parallel. And you get a 3-year U.S.-China war where all sides have basically underestimated each other or overestimated each other. And you end exactly where it went up, with this singular Korean nation divided into 2 separate states. And it just goes to show you how long a fundamental irrationality can go on in geopolitics when there's inertia preventing it from actually changing. And we're in this situation where one of the reasons I think the North Korea issue is so hard analytically to think about, and we should know how hard it is better than anyone because we got it dead wrong last year, is that it doesn't actually make sense. What we have here is sort of an irrational division that was propped up by a political situation that doesn't exist anymore. And reunification is really the most rational thing if you're separating all the baggage and everything else. And yet we're here and the baggage is very real and we're trying to figure out exactly what's going on. And yet the United States can't get over the fact that it has put so much into South Korea and in the Korean War. China can't forget that it has a defense treaty with North Korea. South Korea is not letting Japan forget about its imperial role in all of this. Russia has baggage in here too, because the Soviets were the ones who initially supported North Korea in the first place. I say all that just to say that the current situation doesn't make sense, and it hasn't made sense for a long time. And we said in a piece earlier this week, I think, Cole, that the most likely scenario was basically just the status quo, this kind of nonsensical status quo, because that's the easiest. Pressures on all the different sides, and especially North and South Korea, are increasing such that they need to rationalize the situation, that it doesn't make sense for this artificial boundary to divide up the Korean nation anymore. Then maybe you do get the kind of activity that very quickly leads to a scenario that before you really couldn't imagine. I don't think that anybody in 1980 was talking about the reunification of Germany. Look how quickly Germany was able to do that, despite all the problems that people said and all the challenges that we're thinking going to happen. That's the real question about Korea. Are we talking about Kim Jong Un is serious? Is South Korea serious? Are China and the U.S. on board with this? They don't want to mess with it anymore? Or are we just in another iteration of the same charade that has gone on for decades? And I honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know how to answer that question. I just know that on a strategic basis, the status quo, A, doesn't make sense, and yet B, has lasted for something like 70 years now.
Well, it actually leads me to my next question. I've been meaning to ask you guys this for a while now. What would you say to the argument that this is somewhat inevitable? This being this inflection point, if you want to call it that. If North Korea is going to continue to develop a nuclear weapons system, right, and the United States is going to oppose it, at some point that, if those are the terms, then it's make or break, right? And I'm asking that question basically to ask, does this happen if Kim is not the leader of North Korea? Does this happen if Trump is not the leader of the United States? Or does this happen because it had to happen the closer you got to a deliverable nuclear warhead onto the U.S. mainland, which was the endpoint for all of this?
I mean, I think you sort of lay it out in the way that we should be looking at it is, I mean, there's two fundamental realities here and that we need to be watching. One is North Korea actually willing to give up its nukes? And two, if not, is the U.S. actually willing to do something about it with force? To this point, we've seen no suggestion that the North is serious about handing over its nukes. And it's certainly possible that the U.S. could try to do something about it. But as you pointed out, Jacob, the path of least resistance is to just try to manage North Korea as a nuclear power, learn to live with it in the way that we have with Pakistan and with China and others. And maybe that's easier to do if with some kind of arrangement that puts a cap on the distance of their ballistic missiles, or until we see movement on either one of those sides, the status quo is going to persist, it seems like. And within that, that's where we get, Cole, what you talked about, sort of some imaginative thinking. That's the framework, and how it plays out within that is open to all sorts of scenarios. But there's not going to be some kind of grand bargain or fundamental shifting in the situation until we see movement on one of those two factors.
Well, yeah, and this is something that, Philip, you've pointed out in a lot of your writing. And I think this gets to your question as well, Cole, which is one of the things that is different about this is Donald Trump is willing to use the office of the American presidency much different than any of his predecessors. He is willing to go and see Kim before a lot of this stuff was figured out. I think if this had been a prior administration, they would have been a lot more cautious. They wouldn't have wanted to get involved at the sort of president to dear leader level until there had been a lot more understandings that they could tangibly show and write policy papers about and pat themselves on the back about. For better or for worse, Trump wants something to show for everything that he's done. He wants to show that he has some tangible thing. And that tangible thing is not going to be a North Korean promise to give up nuclear weapons. It's not going to be any kind of fundamental reordering of the situation. All that has happened in the last week, and it is unprecedented, but all that has happened is that Kim and Trump met. They had a meeting. They had a conversation. And you can make the argument that this changes the tone, or this changes the approach, or this signals that both sides are willing to be more pragmatic. But until you actually have some agreement about what that looks like, I think we don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill. Two men who wanted to have this meeting for their own domestic purposes had the meeting. Am I going too far there?
No, I mean, I think the only thing different between what was achieved under the George W. Bush administration and the Bill Clinton administration, the only thing different now is that North Korea has nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles that can fly a really long way, even if they can't necessarily hit the U.S. with any kind of reliability. Everything else is kind of optics. And so I don't think it's much more than a molehill. Maybe these optics matter, maybe they don't. That's, it's a hard question.
If this is a molehill, then let's treat it as such, right? It doesn't really matter. This is just a tiny little blip on the radar, and we're going to move on. The only reason this would matter, I think, is for what it may or may not do to the security architecture. And I don't love that term, but it's better than me fumbling over myself on a microphone trying to find a better one. The security architecture of East Asia. The U.S. is kind of a linchpin of that. The United States guarantees the security for all these places. Does Korea have any bearing on this whatsoever?
I guess just to push back against what I was saying earlier, my own point. I mean, it is, the summit itself is a molehill, but it does point to deeper processes that are underway that are extremely important for the future of the region, like you pointed out. And how this plays out will have fundamental consequences for the U.S. security posture, the U.S. security alliance structure, Japan, China, so forth. It could have profound implications. Depends on what happens with the U.S. troops on the peninsula, reunification. If Japan gets nervous, which we suspect it will, if Japan thinks that a U.S. that cannot be nuked will be less likely to come to its defense when Japan itself still can be nuked, if there's some kind of deal on the distance of ballistic missiles that basically protects the U.S. but hangs Japan out to dry. It's hard to say exactly how that undermines confidence in the U.S. alliance, or how it affects maybe U.S. attention to the region if the U.S. is prone to getting distracted by crises elsewhere in the world. That's the kind of stuff that we need to be keeping a close eye on.
I guess just to piggyback on that, for me, it depends on what North Korea's true intentions are. If North Korea is serious and if it really wants to get away from China a little bit, this is a big victory for the United States, because this takes one of the only allies that China has by treaty and takes them out of that and embarrasses China on that stage and adds yet another feather into the United States cap in the region. If North Korea is not serious about this, or if it is doing this to try and lead to a situation where the United States is less powerful, or is trying to do this to embarrass the United States, how far is the United States going to be willing to go? Is the United States just going to stop military exercises, but it's going to remain stationed in South Korea with all of its military forces, and it's not going to, well, I'm not so sure that much changes there. The real thing here is what happens if the United States decides that it's in its best interest to withdraw. Perhaps that's good for China in the short term. Perhaps that makes Japan more aggressive, and perhaps the architecture really does change because all of the U.S. allies in the Pacific take from the U.S., leaving an ally out to dry. Well, we can't trust the United States that much anymore. We're either going to have to make our own accommodations with China, or we're going to have to make our own accommodations with Japan. Maybe this is the beginning of Japan leading a sort of regional patchwork alliance where these countries realize they have to work together in order to contain China, which is being more aggressive. That's for me what it comes down to. If North Korea is just playing along and this is all part of the Chinese game, then this is just a small part of a much broader US-China conflict. It's a setback for the United States because it means the United States is going to have to be that much more solicitous of the Philippines, of Japan, of all these other different countries that are going to look to the United States and say, why should we trust you?
Yeah, I do think what the most interesting thing that could happen is if China gets nervous, because if China starts being much more proactive in trying to influence the shape of the regime in North Korea, or as a way of preventing an outcome that it does not like, things could get messy in a hurry.
You actually read my mind. I was going to ask you about China, but you answered before I even asked. I guess as a follow-on to that, though, suppose it does start going south for China. Do they get any more expansionist or any more aggressive than they already are in some of the East China Sea, South China Sea, things like that, which is not a direct confrontation with the United States, but it is kind of provocative, right? Does that behavior change at all?
I don't think it does, just because I think they're already doing what they think they need to do there. And whatever happens on the Korean Peninsula won't affect that. What they're doing in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and now into the Indian Ocean basin, they're pushing outward ever so slowly, trying not to trigger a backlash, trying not to cross any red lines, being very careful not to do so. It's sort of getting their way. They're going to do that one way or another. It doesn't matter, I don't think, so much of exactly how the Korean Peninsula, what it looks like in 10 years from now.
Well, and just to add on to that, China is not ready for that. China is not ready to, for real, clash with the United States. What China needs more than anything right now is time. It needs time to harmonize its economic inefficiencies. It needs time to develop its own military capabilities. It needs time to isolate Taiwan more diplomatically, although I don't know how much more you can isolate them diplomatically. China needs time. It's not ready to go head to head with the United States right now. It's certainly not willing to cross any U.S. red lines. that would force the United States to take back some of these areas or push back against China. I think China has to, as Philip said, he emphasized that they have to go bit by bit, slowly. It's you're boiling what's the metaphor where you boil the thing in water? Is it a frog?
Right. It's a frog, but the metaphor's flawed because the test was conducted on frog that had parts of their brains removed. Just, as in,
I see.
Just to point that out.
And I really don't know why you'd want to boil a frog.
Yeah, they're better grilled.
But the point I'm making here is that China needs time more than anything else. It's not ready. So anything China can do to look good or to make the United States look bad or to increase its soft power or to increase its prestige or image on the world stage, that's good for China right now. That's all it's really going to do. I think you just expect to see China do more of what it's doing in small incremental ways, that it won't push the envelope until it's ready to. That's just not how the Chinese are going to do it.
Yeah, my point on China getting nervous about Korea is more what I was getting at, is that if they don't like the outcome, if they think that North Korea, Pyongyang, is about to move into the U.S. orbit or maybe enter into some kind of grand bargain that, as we laid out, ends up with them being, a de facto ally of the U.S., they do have enormous leverage and ability to influence events in Pyongyang. And Pyongyang will be exceedingly cautious about alienating China too much because of that. Especially as, if Kim Jong Un is serious about opening up the economy and trying to liberalize to an extent, the Chinese would have quite a bit. Their biggest fear would be liberalizing the economy without undermining the regime's tight control. And it's really hard to do. And China would have the ability to poke and prod in ways that would potentially undermine Pyongyang's control in the country.
Well, I'm not sure you can get a more imaginative scenario than that, Cole, because that scenario that Philip just described is where the United States is going to feel pressured to intervene to protect North Korea from Chinese aggressive moves.
So. Exactly. Yeah. That's we're entering the realm of science fiction at that point. Well, I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank you guys for joining me this week.
Do you mean out of time that you have to go watch more soccer now, or we're actually out of time?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, we're in podcast stoppage time right now. We've had to add 5 to 7 minutes because we screwed up so many times. But that's why you have stoppage time there at the end. No, actually, don't be silly, Jacob. It's the afternoon already. I think most of the games are already over. These are early morning games for the most part.
Portugal's up on Spain 2-1.
Nice. Iran beat Morocco on a heartbreaker last minute, and the Uruguay Egypt game was a last minute heartbreaker too. Solly not playing, so what are you gonna do? All right, well that's enough for World Cup podcast hour. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you all next time.